A single black father was sleeping in row 11, when the captain asked, "Is there a doctor on board?" The gentle hum of the airplane engines had finally lulled Dr. Marcus Hale into the first peaceful sleep he'd had in months. His long frame was cramped uncomfortably in the economy seat of row 11, but for once, he didn't mind. Beside him, his 10-year-old daughter Maya pressed her face against the small window, watching clouds drift by like cotton balls scattered across an endless blue canvas. "Daddy, look how tiny everything looks down there," Maya whispered, her voice filled with the wonder that only children possess. Her dark eyes sparkled with excitement as she pointed at the patchwork of fields and roads below. Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of joy and guilt. This was their first real vacation since Sarah had passed away 2 years ago. 2 long years of 16-hour shifts at the community clinic, of takeout dinners eaten over homework, of bedtime stories interrupted by emergency calls. 2 years of being both mother and father to a little girl who deserved so much more than the fragments of time he could offer between saving other people's lives. "I see it, sweetheart," he murmured, adjusting the small blanket around her shoulders. "Pretty amazing, isn't it?" Maya nodded enthusiastically. "Mommy would have loved this, wouldn't she?" The familiar ache settled in Marcus's chest, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "Yes, baby. She would have loved seeing you this happy." This trip to Hawaii was supposed to be their fresh start. A week of just the two of them, building sandcastles and swimming in crystal-clear water. No pagers, no emergency calls, no exhausted collapses into bed at midnight only to wake up at 5 the next morning. Just a father and daughter remembering how to be a family again. Marcus had saved for 18 months to afford this vacation. Every extra shift, every weekend spent at the clinic instead of at Maya's soccer games, every penny pinched and stretched until it screamed. But seeing the pure joy on his daughter's face as they boarded the plane made every sacrifice worth it. The Boeing 737 was packed with families headed to paradise. Children chattered excitedly in the rows ahead while parents juggled diaper bags and tablets loaded with cartoons. The familiar sounds of travel surrounded them, the rustle of snack packages, the low murmur of conversations, the occasional cry of an overtired baby. Marcus had just begun to drift off again when Maya tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, that man up there doesn't look good." Following her gaze, Marcus spotted a passenger in row 7 who appeared to be in distress. The middle-aged man was clutching his chest, his face pale and covered in sweat. His wife beside him looked panicked, frantically pressing the call button above their seats. Before Marcus could process what was happening, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom system, cutting through the ambient noise of the cabin like a knife through silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a medical emergency on board. Is there a doctor on this aircraft? If you are a medical professional, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around the cabin, passengers began looking around expectantly, craning their necks to see if anyone would step forward. The usual vacation chatter died to an uncomfortable whisper as everyone waited for someone, anyone, to respond. Marcus felt his stomach clench. He knew he should get up. He was probably the most qualified person on this plane to handle whatever medical crisis was unfolding. But something held him frozen in his seat, an invisible weight pressing down on his shoulders. It wasn't fear of the medical emergency. He'd handled countless critical situations in his 15 years as a physician. It wasn't even the confined space of the airplane cabin or the limited medical supplies that would be available. It was something else entirely. Something that made his jaw tighten and his hands curl into fists. Maya looked up at him with those same trusting eyes that reminded him so much of Sarah. "Daddy, aren't you going to help?" The innocence in her voice cut through his hesitation. Of course he was going to help. How could he not? This was why he became a doctor in the first place, to save lives, to ease suffering, to be there when people needed him most. But as Marcus slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and rose to his feet, he felt the familiar sensation that had followed him throughout his career. The moment his 6'2" frame emerged from row 11, dozens of eyes turned toward him with expressions that ranged from surprise to skepticism to outright doubt. A young businessman in row 9 actually turned around to look past Marcus, as if expecting the real doctor to be standing behind him. An elderly woman near the front of the plane squinted at him through her glasses, her lips pursed in obvious disapproval. Even some of the flight attendants seemed uncertain, their professional smiles wavering as they processed his appearance. Marcus had experienced this reaction countless times before, in hospital corridors, at medical conferences, even in his own clinic when new patients arrived expecting someone who looked different. But somehow, trapped 30,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean with his daughter watching, it felt more suffocating than ever. The whispers started immediately. "Are you sure he's really a doctor? He looks awfully young. Maybe we should wait and see if someone else responds." The comments weren't meant to be loud enough for him to hear, but in the confined space of the airplane cabin, every word carried. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a familiar anger that he'd learned to swallow and suppress over the years. Maya had unbuckled her seatbelt and was standing on her seat, watching her father with pride and confusion. She didn't understand why people were looking at him like that. In her eyes, her daddy was the smartest, most capable person in the world. He fixed people when they were broken. He made pain go away. He saved lives every single day. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice steady and professional despite the emotions churning inside him. "I'm a physician. Where's the patient?" A flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a name tag reading, Jessica, approached him cautiously. Her smile was polite but strained, and Marcus could see the uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Sir, we do need to verify your credentials before." "There's no time for that," Marcus interrupted, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that commanded respect in every emergency room he'd ever worked in. "Someone's having a medical crisis. Every second counts." But instead of leading him to the patient, Jessica hesitated, glancing nervously toward the front of the plane where her supervisor was already approaching with quick, measured steps. Marcus felt the weight of every passenger's gaze on his shoulders. He could sense their doubt, their hesitation, their unspoken questions about his qualifications. It was a burden he'd carried his entire career, but tonight, with Maya watching and a stranger's life hanging in the balance, it felt heavier than ever before. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, literally flying to paradise with his daughter, only to find himself once again having to prove his worth in a situation where every moment of delay could mean the difference between life and death. As he stood there in the aisle of row 11, Dr. Marcus Hale took a deep breath and prepared to fight the same battle he'd been fighting his entire professional life. The battle to be seen as a doctor first, and everything else second. The patient was still clutching his chest, his breathing becoming more labored by the second, and Marcus knew that whatever obstacles lay ahead, he couldn't let another human being suffer because of other people's preconceptions. But first, he would have to get past the wall of doubt that seemed to materialize wherever he went, even 30,000 feet above the ocean. The senior flight attendant, a stern-looking woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, approached Marcus with the kind of measured steps usually reserved for approaching wild animals. Her name tag read, Margaret, and everything about her demeanor suggested she was the type of person who followed protocol to the letter, regardless of circumstances. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification before we can allow you to treat the passenger," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Marcus felt his jaw clench. Behind Margaret, he could see the patient, a man in his mid-50s whose lips were beginning to take on a bluish tint that Marcus recognized immediately. Classic signs of a heart attack, and from the look of things, time was running out fast. "Ma'am, I understand your need for protocol, but that man is having what appears to be a cardiac event," Marcus said, his voice remaining professionally calm despite the frustration building inside him. "Every minute we waste could be the difference between. I'm sorry, but we cannot allow unauthorized personnel to." "Unauthorized?" The word came out sharper than Marcus intended, causing several nearby passengers to turn and stare. He took a breath, forcing himself to lower his voice. "I'm telling you I'm a licensed physician. That man needs immediate medical attention." Margaret's expression didn't waver. Sir, anyone can claim to be a doctor. We need proper identification and verification of your medical license before. Oh, for crying out loud! The interruption came from a red-faced passenger in row 6, a heavy-set man in a business suit who had twisted around in his seat to face them. Margaret, I'm Dr. Pemberton from Nashville General, he announced loudly, waving what appeared to be a hospital ID badge. I'll take care of this situation. No need to waste time with verification issues. The relief on Margaret's face was immediate and unmistakable. She practically beamed at Dr. Pemberton, who was already hauling himself out of his seat with considerable effort. The contrast in her reaction was so stark, so obvious, that Marcus felt a familiar burning sensation in his chest. Thank you, Dr. Pemberton, Margaret gushed. Right this way, please. But Marcus wasn't about to back down. Not with a man's life at stake. Wait a minute, he called out, stepping forward. I was here first, and I'm more than qualified to. Son, Dr. Pemberton interrupted, not even looking at Marcus as he pushed past him. Why don't you just sit back down and let the real doctors handle this? The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around the cabin, he could hear the whispers growing louder, more pointed. Some passengers nodded approvingly at Pemberton's intervention. Others pulled out their phones, apparently deciding that this confrontation was worth recording. A young woman with perfectly styled Instagram-ready hair was already live-streaming, speaking in hushed tones to her phone. Oh my God, you guys, there's drama on my flight. Some guy is pretending to be a doctor and trying to treat a passenger having a heart attack. Maya's voice cut through the chaos like a bell. My daddy is a real doctor, she shouted from row 11, her 10-year-old voice carrying across the cabin with startling clarity. He saves people every day. He's the best doctor in the whole world. Several passengers turned to look at the little girl standing defiantly on her seat, her small hands balled into fists, her eyes blazing with indignation on her father's behalf. Some smiled at her fierce loyalty, but others looked skeptical, as if even a child's testimony couldn't be trusted. Marcus felt his heart break a little more. Maya shouldn't have to defend him. She shouldn't have to see her father questioned and doubted like this. This was supposed to be their vacation, their chance to escape from all the complications and prejudices that seemed to follow them everywhere. Listen, everybody just calm down, Margaret said, her voice rising above the growing murmur of the crowd. Dr. Pemberton is handling the situation now. Everyone please return to your seats. But Marcus wasn't giving up. As Pemberton knelt beside the patient, Marcus could see immediately that the older doctor was out of his depth. His hands shook as he loosened the patient's collar, and his breathing was already labored from the simple exertion of moving down the aisle. Check his pulse, Marcus called out, ignoring Margaret's sharp look. And we need to get him flat. Elevate his legs. Pemberton glanced back irritably. I know what I'm doing. But it was clear he didn't. Marcus watched in growing alarm as Pemberton fumbled with the patient's shirt buttons, his movements clumsy and uncertain. The patient's wife was crying now, begging someone to help her husband, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark streams. Please, she sobbed. Somebody help him. He's turning blue. A flight attendant named David, younger than the others and clearly uncomfortable with the situation, approached Marcus quietly. Sir, he whispered, do you really think you could help? Because honestly, Dr. Pemberton looks like he might need medical attention himself. It was true. Pemberton was sweating profusely, his face red and his breathing shallow. The stress of the situation combined with what was probably decades of poor fitness was taking its toll. Marcus looked past David to see his daughter still standing on her seat, watching him with those trusting eyes. Maya believed in him completely, without question, without doubt. In her world, her daddy was a hero who could fix anything, heal anyone, make everything better. Maybe it was time he started believing in himself the same way. Yes, Marcus said firmly, loud enough for Margaret to hear. I can help him. But I need access to the patient, and I need it now. The cabin had grown quiet except for the patient's labored breathing and his wife's soft crying. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Some had their phones out, recording every moment of this mid-flight drama. Marcus straightened his shoulders and looked Margaret directly in the eyes. You want to see my credentials? Fine. But while we're wasting time playing bureaucrat, that man is dying. So you can either let me help him right now, or you can explain to his widow why protocol was more important than her husband's life. The challenge hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and consequence. Around the cabin, passengers held their breath, sensing that this moment would define everything that came next. Margaret's facade cracked for just a moment, her eyes darting between Marcus and the increasingly distressed patient. The man's breathing had become shallow and rapid, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that made several nearby passengers gasp in alarm. Dr. Pemberton, meanwhile, was fumbling through the aircraft's limited medical kit with shaking hands, muttering under his breath about outdated equipment and inadequate supplies. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he struggled to remember procedures he probably hadn't performed in years. Fine, Margaret said finally, her voice tight with reluctance. But I'm noting in the incident report that you proceeded against protocol. And Dr. Pemberton supervises. Marcus didn't waste time arguing. He pushed past Margaret and knelt beside the patient, his trained hands immediately going to check vitals while his eyes assessed the situation with the calm efficiency that had saved hundreds of lives over the years. What's his name? Marcus asked the sobbing wife. Tom Richardson, she managed between tears. He's 53. He has high blood pressure, but he takes medication for it. This morning he said his chest felt tight, but he insisted we still take the flight. Has he ever had heart problems before? Marcus asked, his fingers finding Tom's pulse while simultaneously checking his pupils with the small penlight from the medical kit. His father died of a heart attack at 55, she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it more real. A sharp voice cut through his concentration. Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing? Marcus looked up to see a woman in scrubs standing in the aisle. Her name tag identified her as Linda Morrison, RN, and her expression was filled with the kind of territorial aggression that Marcus had encountered from some nurses throughout his career. I'm stabilizing the patient, Marcus replied evenly, not pausing in his examination. With whose authorization? Linda demanded, crossing her arms. I'm a cardiac nurse with 15 years of experience at Mercy General. I should be handling this situation, not some. She paused, her eyes scanning Marcus dismissively. Random person claiming to be a doctor. Dr. Pemberton, looking relieved to have an ally, nodded vigorously. Nurse Morrison is absolutely right. This is highly irregular. Marcus felt the familiar fire of frustration, but Tom's pulse was becoming more erratic by the minute. This man is having an ST elevation myocardial infarction, he said firmly. We need to get him flat, start oxygen if available, and prepare for the possibility of cardiac arrest. How could you possibly know that without an EKG? Linda challenged, moving closer with an aggressive stance that suggested she was prepared for a confrontation. Because I can read the classic signs, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the growing crowd of onlookers, many with phones now openly recording the medical drama unfolding at 30,000 feet. Crushing chest pain, diaphoresis, shortness of breath, and look at his color. Anyone can list symptoms they Googled. Linda interrupted. Show us your medical license, or step away from the patient. The cabin had become a theater, with passengers craning their necks and openly filming what they clearly expected to be Marcus's humiliation. Some were already typing on their phones, probably crafting social media posts about the drama they were witnessing. A teenager in row 8 was live streaming to what appeared to be hundreds of viewers. You guys, this is insane. There's this guy pretending to be a doctor, and the real medical people are trying to stop him from hurting someone. Maya's voice rang out again, cutting through the noise. Stop being mean to my daddy. He helps sick people every day. But this time, her childish defense seemed to fuel more skepticism. Marcus heard someone mutter. Great, now he's got his kid in on it too. That was the breaking point. Marcus had endured the doubt, the demands for credentials, the assumption that he was somehow fraudulent or dangerous. But hearing someone suggest that his 10-year-old daughter was part of some elaborate deception made something snap inside him. He stood up abruptly, his full 6'2" frame commanding attention. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of every emergency room he'd ever commanded, every life he'd ever saved, every impossible case he'd ever solved. Enough, the single word silenced the cabin. That man is dying while you people play politics. Linda, if you're really a cardiac nurse, then you know we need to act now. Dr. Pemberton, with respect, when's the last time you actually treated an active MI? Pemberton's face reddened, but he didn't answer. Marcus turned to address the entire cabin, his voice clear and professional. My name is Dr. Marcus Hale. I've been practicing emergency medicine for 15 years. I've treated over 2,000 cardiac patients. And right now, that man has maybe 10 minutes before this becomes irreversible. He knelt back down beside Tom, whose breathing was becoming more labored. Linda, if you really are a nurse, help me. Otherwise, get out of my way. For a moment, professional instinct overrode personal bias. Linda hesitated, then knelt on the opposite side of the patient. What do you need? Oxygen, if they have it. Aspirin from someone's carry-on. And we need to keep him calm. Marcus's hands moved with practiced efficiency, loosening Tom's collar and positioning him for optimal breathing. Tom's eyes fluttered open, focused on Marcus's face. Am I dying? Not on my watch, Marcus said with quiet confidence, and something in his tone, the absolute certainty of a man who had pulled people back from the edge countless times, seemed to reassure not just Tom, but everyone watching. Slowly, reluctantly, respect began to creep into the faces around him. Even Linda found herself following his instructions without question, her professional training recognizing competence when she saw it. But the phones were still recording, and Marcus knew that no matter what happened next, this moment would define not just Tom's survival, but his own reputation in ways he couldn't yet imagine. 20 minutes later, Tom Richardson's breathing had stabilized. The grayish pallor had faded from his skin, replaced by a healthier pink tone that brought visible relief to his wife's tear-streaked face. Marcus had improvised brilliantly with the limited supplies available, using techniques he'd learned during his residency at an underfunded county hospital where creativity was often the difference between life and death. Linda Morrison, the cardiac nurse who had initially challenged him, was now following his instructions with something approaching admiration. Even Dr. Pemberton had retreated to his seat, mumbling something about impressive field medicine under his breath. His pulse is steady now, Linda reported, her voice professional but noticeably warmer than before. Blood pressure is still elevated, but within manageable range. Marcus nodded, continuing to monitor Tom's vitals while keeping one eye on the improvised Ford drip he'd fashioned from the aircraft's medical supplies. We need to keep him stable until we can get him to a proper cardiac unit. How much longer until we land? Margaret, who had been conspicuously absent during the actual medical emergency, reappeared with the captain behind her. Captain Rodriguez was a distinguished man in his 50s with graying temples and the kind of calm demeanor that inspired confidence in turbulent situations. Dr. Hale, the captain said, extending his hand. I understand you've performed something of a miracle back here. We're diverting to Los Angeles International. They have one of the best cardiac facilities on the West Coast standing by. The respect in the captain's voice was unmistakable, and it rippled through the cabin like a stone dropped in still water. Passengers who had been whispering and recording began to look at Marcus with new eyes. The teenager who had been live streaming earlier was now explaining to her followers that the guy was actually legit the whole time. Tom's eyes fluttered open again, focusing on Marcus with growing clarity. Thank you, he whispered hoarsely. I thought I was going to die. You're going to be fine, Marcus assured him. We'll have you in a proper hospital within the hour. As Tom's vision cleared further, his expression changed from gratitude to confusion, then to something that looked almost like recognition. He stared at Marcus intently, as if trying to place a face from a distant memory. Excuse me, Tom said, his voice stronger now. But have we met before? You look familiar. Marcus felt a cold sensation creep up his spine. There was something about Tom's voice, something in the way he carried himself even while lying on the narrow aisle floor, that triggered a memory Marcus had tried to bury for years. I don't think so, Marcus replied carefully, though his instincts told him otherwise. Tom's wife leaned closer to her husband. Honey, you need to rest. Don't worry about. No, wait, Tom interrupted, struggling to sit up slightly. What did you say your name was? Doctor? Hale, Marcus said reluctantly. Dr. Marcus Hale. The change in Tom's expression was immediate and dramatic. His eyes widened, and despite his weakened condition, he managed to push himself up on his elbows with sudden urgency. Marcus Hale, Tom repeated slowly, as if testing the name on his tongue. Emergency medicine. You applied for a residency position at Whitmore Medical Group about. What was it? 12 years ago? The blood drained from Marcus's face. Around them, the curious passengers continued to watch, but now the dynamic had shifted in a way that made Marcus's stomach churn with a mixture of recognition and old anger. I'm Charles Whitmore, Tom continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I'm the CEO of Whitmore Medical Group. You saved my life. The irony hit Marcus like a physical blow. Charles Whitmore. The man whose hospital network had rejected his residency application despite his stellar academic record, despite his recommendations, despite his obvious qualifications. The rejection letter had been polite but firm. While your credentials are impressive, we feel that other candidates would be a better fit for our program. Marcus remembered every word of that letter. He'd read it so many times that he could recite it from memory. It had been his dream position, prestigious, well-funded, with access to cutting-edge technology and renowned specialists. Instead, he'd ended up at an overworked county hospital where the equipment was outdated and the hours were brutal. You remember me, Marcus said quietly, and it wasn't a question. Charles nodded slowly, and for the first time since regaining consciousness, he looked uncomfortable. Ah, yes. I remember reviewing your application personally. The cabin had grown quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. The passengers sensed something significant happening, though most didn't understand what. Linda and Margaret were both staring, trying to piece together the undercurrents of tension that had suddenly emerged. Maya, who had been watching the entire medical drama with wide eyes, chose that moment to speak up from row 11. Daddy, is that the man who said you weren't good enough? Out of the mouths of babes. Marcus had told Maya the story years ago, during one of those late-night conversations when she'd asked why they lived in a small apartment instead of a big house like some of her friends. He tried to explain it in terms a child could understand. Sometimes grown-ups make unfair decisions, and sometimes you have to work twice as hard to prove yourself. Charles Whitmore's face went pale again, but this time it wasn't from cardiac distress. The weight of recognition, and guilt, settled over his features like a dark cloud. Your daughter? He asked weakly. My daughter, Marcus confirmed, his voice steady but his eyes blazing with years of suppressed frustration and anger. Around them, the dynamics of the entire situation had shifted. The man whose life Marcus had just saved was the same man who had once deemed him unworthy of professional opportunity. The doctor who had been doubted and challenged by everyone on the plane had just proven his worth to the very person who had first questioned it 12 years earlier. The phones were still recording, but now they were capturing something far more complex than a simple medical emergency. They were documenting a moment of reckoning that none of them could have anticipated. Words spread through the cabin like wildfire. The kind of whispered conversations that happen when passengers have nothing but time and a captivating story unfolding right in front of them. Within minutes, nearly everyone on Flight 447 knew the basic facts. The black doctor who had been questioned and doubted had just saved the life of a prominent white hospital CEO who had once rejected him. Linda Morrison, the cardiac nurse who had initially challenged Marcus, was the first to piece together the broader implications. She'd worked in hospital systems long enough to recognize the coded language of institutional bias when she saw it. Wait, she said quietly, kneeling closer to Marcus as he continued monitoring Charles's vitals. You applied to Whitmore Medical 12 years ago? With your skills, your knowledge. Why weren't you accepted? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus didn't answer immediately, his attention focused on adjusting Charles's improvised fore. But his silence spoke volumes. Margaret, who had demanded his credentials earlier, was now eavesdropping from a few feet away. Her face showed the first signs of understanding and shame. She'd worked in customer service long enough to recognize prejudice when it was staring her in the face. Dr. Pemberton, the older physician who had so confidently pushed past Marcus earlier, was noticeably quiet in his seat. Several passengers had begun looking at him with barely concealed disgust, whispering about his assumptions and his obvious incompetence when it mattered most. Charles himself was struggling with more than just his recovering heart condition. Every few minutes, he would look at Marcus with an expression that seemed caught between gratitude and guilt. His wife, Patricia, had been holding his hand throughout the ordeal, but now she was studying Marcus with new eyes. Charles, she said quietly, tell me you didn't. Not now, Patricia, Charles whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. A passenger in row 5, an elderly black woman who had been watching the entire drama unfold, spoke up with the kind of moral authority that comes from decades of experience with injustice. Young man, she called to Marcus. How long did it take you to become the doctor you are today after they turned you down? Marcus looked up from his patient, meeting her eyes across the cabin. 15 years, he said simply. But I had to do it at county hospitals, community clinics. Places where the equipment was older, the hours were longer, and the pay was, he shrugged, less. And you're how good at what you do? She pressed, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. He's exceptional, Linda Morrison answered before Marcus could respond. I've worked with cardiac specialists for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone improvise like this with such limited resources. What he did here. She gestured to Charles, who was now breathing normally. This should have been impossible without a full cardiac unit. The elderly woman nodded knowingly. And Mr. Whitmore, what kind of doctors did you hire instead? Charles closed his eyes, as if he could make the conversation disappear by not looking at it. But Patricia wasn't going to let him off that easily. Charles, answer her, she said firmly. What kind of doctors did you hire for that residency program? The entire cabin was listening now. Even the flight attendants had stopped their service to watch this moral reckoning unfold at cruising altitude. We hired qualified candidates, Charles said weakly. Were they more qualified than Dr. Hale? Patricia pressed. The silence stretched out for long, uncomfortable seconds. Finally, Charles opened his eyes and looked directly at Marcus. No, he admitted quietly. They weren't. Maya's voice cut through the tension with the brutal honesty that only children possess. So why didn't you pick my daddy? He's the smartest person I know. Charles looked at the 10-year-old girl standing on her seat in row 11, her face full of genuine confusion about why anyone would choose someone less qualified than her father. How do you explain institutional racism to a child who sees the world in terms of fairness and logic? Your daddy is very smart, Charles said finally, his voice heavy with regret. I made a mistake 12 years ago. A terrible mistake. But Marcus wasn't interested in Charles's guilt. His focus remained on his patient's recovery, his hands steady and professional as he monitored vitals and adjusted the makeshift treatment. If he was feeling vindicated, or angry, or satisfied by this turn of events, his face didn't show it. A businessman in row 3 spoke up suddenly. Dr. Hale, what hospital do you work at now? Riverside Community Medical Center, Marcus replied without looking up from his patient. Several passengers pulled out their phones, apparently Googling the hospital. The businessman frowned at his screen. This says it's in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. Underfunded. Understaffed. That's right, Marcus said simply. But you could be working anywhere, Linda said, her voice filled with indignation on his behalf. With your skills, any hospital in the country would. Would they? Marcus interrupted gently, finally looking up. How many of you questioned whether I was really a doctor when I stood up to help? How many of you assumed Dr. Pemberton was more qualified just because he looked the part? The questions silenced the cabin. Passengers who had been recording the drama suddenly seemed uncomfortable with their phones, as if they were documenting their own participation in something they were only now beginning to understand. Charles struggled to sit up more, his face flushed with more than just medical distress. Dr. Hale, I know I can't undo what happened 12 years ago, but I want you to know that I'm going to make this right. Whatever it takes. Marcus continued his work, checking Charles's pulse one more time. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. Mr. Whitmore, he said quietly, right now, all I care about is making sure you survive long enough to see your family again. Everything else is just conversation. But even as he spoke those words, Marcus could feel the weight of 15 years of fighting for respect, 15 years of proving himself over and over again, 15 years of working twice as hard for half the recognition. And now, 30,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, the entire cabin was finally beginning to understand what he'd been up against all along. The Boeing 737 began its descent into Los Angeles International Airport, as the California coastline came into view through the small windows. The medical emergency was over. Charles Whitmore was stable, alert, and would make a full recovery thanks to Marcus's intervention. But the moral reckoning that had unfolded in the cabin was far from resolved. As passengers began gathering their belongings in preparation for landing, Charles struggled to sit up straighter, his eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that suggested he wasn't going to let this conversation end with a simple thank you. Dr. Hale, he said, his voice stronger now but still carrying the weight of his earlier admission. Before we land, I need to speak with you privately. Marcus finished securing the improvised medical equipment and looked at Charles with the same professional detachment he'd maintained throughout the crisis. Mr. Whitmore, you should rest. The paramedics will take good care of you once we're on the ground. Please, Charles insisted, and there was something in his tone, desperation, perhaps, or genuine remorse, that made Marcus pause. Just 5 minutes. Margaret, the senior flight attendant who had initially demanded Marcus's credentials, approached nervously. Dr. Hale, I wanted to apologize for earlier. I should have trusted your word from the beginning. Marcus nodded graciously, but his attention remained focused on his patient. Around the cabin, similar conversations were taking place as passengers grappled with their own behavior during the emergency. The teenager who had been live streaming was now posting follow-up videos explaining how wrong she'd been about the situation. Dr. Pemberton had retreated to his seat and remained conspicuously quiet, apparently unwilling to face the reality of his own inadequacy and prejudice. Linda Morrison, however, had taken a different approach entirely. Dr. Hale, she said, approaching with her business card in hand, I work at Cedars-Sinai. If you ever want to discuss opportunities in Los Angeles, I'd be honored to introduce you to our cardiac department chief. Marcus accepted the card politely but didn't commit to anything. His focus remained on Maya, who was watching the entire interaction with the wide-eyed fascination of a child witnessing adult drama she didn't fully comprehend. As the plane continued its descent, Charles made one more attempt to get Marcus's attention. Doctor, I know you probably want nothing to do with me, but I'm trying to offer you something here. Marcus finally looked directly at Charles, his expression unreadable. What are you offering, Mr. Whitmore? A position, Charles said quickly, as if afraid Marcus might walk away before he could finish. Chief of Emergency Medicine at our flagship hospital in Beverly Hills. Full department control, unlimited resources, a salary that's... Well, it's probably triple what you're making now. The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, passengers who were within earshot turned to listen, sensing that this moment would determine how the story ended. Patricia Whitmore looked at her husband with surprise. Charles, are you serious? Dead serious, Charles replied, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. It's the least I can do after what I cost you 12 years ago. Maya had unbuckled her seatbelt, and was making her way down the aisle toward her father, her small face bright with excitement. "Daddy, does this mean we can get a bigger apartment? And maybe I can have my own room?" The innocence in her question seemed to break something inside Charles. Here was a child who had been living in cramped quarters because of his decision 12 years ago, a brilliant doctor who had been relegated to underfunded clinics because of institutional bias that Charles had not only allowed but perpetuated. But Marcus's response surprised everyone in the cabin. "Mr. Whitmore," he said quietly, kneeling down to Maya's level and putting his arm around her shoulders. "I appreciate the offer. I really do. But I'm going to have to decline." Charles looked stunned. But why? This is everything you should have had 12 years ago. This is me trying to make it right." Marcus stood up, his full height once again commanding the attention of everyone nearby. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of years of hard-earned wisdom. "Because what you're offering isn't justice, Mr. Whitmore. It's guilt. You want to give me a job now because I saved your life and you feel bad about what you did. But what about all the other qualified doctors you've passed over? What about all the patients who could have been saved if you'd made different choices 12 years ago?" He paused, looking around the cabin at all the faces watching him, passengers who had doubted him, flight attendants who had demanded his credentials, medical professionals who had challenged his authority. "If you really want to make this right," Marcus continued, "don't offer me a token position to ease your conscience. Change your hiring practices. Create real opportunities for doctors who look like me. Make sure that what happened to me 12 years ago never happens to anyone else." Charles's face went through a range of emotions: surprise, shame, and finally, something that looked like respect. "And if you do that," Marcus added, "if you really commit to changing how things work at Whitmore Medical Group, then maybe we can talk. But not as a favor to ease your guilt. As partners working towards something better." Maya looked up at her father with pure adoration. "Daddy, does this mean we're going back to our regular life?" Marcus smiled down at his daughter, the first genuinely relaxed smile he'd worn since the emergency began. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going back to our regular life. And you know what? Our regular life is pretty amazing just the way it is." As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, the passengers burst into spontaneous applause, not just for the successful emergency landing, but for the moral courage they had just witnessed. Marcus Hale had saved a man's life and, in the process, had reminded everyone in that cabin that dignity and principle were worth more than any salary or position. Walking back to row 11 with Maya's small hand in his, Marcus was no longer the invisible man who had been doubted and questioned. He was exactly what he had always been: a brilliant doctor, a loving father, and a man who refused to compromise his values, even 30,000 feet above the ground. The vacation could finally begin.